Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Step into History digital edition. My name's Tim. I'm a historian here at the museum. And as always, I thank Holly Schaefer, our museum manager, for setting us up in these Step into Histories. And today I'm going to share the story of electrifying Fort Myers. One of the reasons I chose this topic because, of course, Thomas Edison being the great electrician, there was all kinds of stories that have swirled around this little town of Fort Myers throughout history about how they got their electric. I caught an interest in it and decided to investigate it further. So I'm going to give you the details of my research on electrifying Fort Myers. Lighting Fort Myers, Albertus Alfondos Gardner. He is the man that gets the credit for providing the little town of Fort Myers with their first electrical power plant. And we have a little picture of Birdie. People called him Birdie. There he is in the upper right-hand corner. And I'm going to give you the story of the electricity and Fort Myers. Now, things happened here in the late 19th and early 20th century. Things really began to happen here in Southwest Florida. The businessmen of this little town known as Fort Myers were really motivated to attract customers here. So one of the biggest events that happened in 1884 was the arrival of the Gardner family. The Gardners arrived via the Caloosahatchee River in 1884. They quickly made an impact on the tiny frontier town. W.P. Gardner, who was looking to restore his health, brought his family down from Louisiana to start a new life. Now, Mr. Gardner purchased 22 acres of land near Fort Myers with the intention of starting a nursery. And this was the write-up. This was under Good News and the Fort Myers Weekly Press. So the Gardner's arrival already created a story in the newspaper. They were given a warm welcome on page 3 of the Weekly Press. They purchased 22 acres somewhere near Fort Myers. So I wanted to find out where exactly that was. What I found out is a confusing story. They had a place in Alva, and then they also had a place in town proper, Fort Myers. I was able to hunt up the deed on the 17th of April, 1885. The Gardner family purchased some property from the Hendrys. Francis A. Hendry and Ardeline sold the Gardners 24 acres of property. It was on the corner of 2nd Street, at 2nd and Lee. It went all the way over to Huff Street and out to what we now know as MLK at the junction of Thompson and Anderson Avenue. And I have a little as soon as they purchased this property, just a few months later, they started the Calusa Nursery. That was the business that they started. So they immediately went to work. They opened this nursery, the Caloosahatchee Nursery, and they sold all the things that you see there. Sweet Mediterranean. They served persimmons, Chinese honey, peen to peaches, grapes, all types of goods were being sold out of the Caloosahatchee Nursery. Here's a map of their property. So you can see the property, the 24 acres. It was from Lee Street to Huff Street, from 2nd Street all the way to the corner of Thompson and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. So right away, the Gardners have now established themselves in downtown Fort Myers with their new property. And on this property, the story begins. But just about the same time that the Gardners bought their property, we don't want to leave out these two famous people. Two friends find Fort Myers, Thomas Edison and Ezra T. Gilliland. So just a few months after or a month before the Gardners bought their property, Thomas and his friend arrived. to Fort Myers, and they purchased the Summerlin property. That's where our property is located today with the museum. And within 2 years' time, Thomas Edison puts up the very first electrical plant here in Fort Myers. He did that during his 1887 winter stay. He built a laboratory on the western side of the property, right along the river. And from there, he had two dynamo generators. He had a water tower, as you can see in the picture there. He had a coal furnace, and he had two dynamo generators. And of course, this created a local buzz. The town had a feeling that they were going to get electricity shortly after. So that was the hope here in Fort Myers, that the people in town would soon get their electricity. And they had good reason to think that, because on April 14th, the news press published an interview. It just so happens in 1887, Sidney Smith, a reporter for the New York World, also came to Fort Myers and interviewed Mr. Edison in that laboratory. During that interview, Mr. Edison made a promise to supply Fort Myers with free electricity for 3 months a year. During a March 28th interview with the New York World, that's what he told Sidney Smith. He published his article and interview up in New York, and they ran it here in the Fort Myers News Press on April 14th, 1887. So people are really getting excited here in Fort Myers. As a matter of fact, a week later, the people of Fort Myers, who fully expected Mr. Edison to provide them with electricity, had a new write-up in the paper. The dynamo to be used in lighting the town of Fort Myers by electricity arrived one day last week. As Mr. Edison is very busy and his stay short, we have our doubts whether he will light Fort Myers by electricity this year or not. They are very busy at present in the laboratory and can hardly spare the time to put up the lamps, which are also here and ready for use. However, the plant will be put in good use next season. So, and they will all rejoice. So the people of Fort Myers are holding Thomas Edison to his promise. They're keeping track. The generators, the wires, everything has arrived. Everyone is extremely excited about this new prospect, and the power plant was going to be right on Mr. Edison's property. Now, that's not how it all turned out. Instead, this is the man here that ends up giving Fort Myers their first electrical power plant. Now, Albertus Gardner, son of Mr. W.P. Gardner, came down with his dad and his sister, and it was a family operation. So there's the details on Mr. Gardner. He became very prominent here in Fort Myers. He was a leader of Fort Myers business. His dad was the mayor of Fort Myers. His fathers often sat on the councils here, and the Gardner family had a huge impact here locally. Now, Mr. Gardner did have contact. The story that I first read about Thomas Edison was that Mr. Gardner himself, before he died, said that Mr. Edison helped him plan out his power grid. So I looked into that, because most businessmen after Edison's death would try to attach themselves to his name, because it usually would get them a little more famous. But the first correspondence I found between Mr. Gardner and Mr. Edison was January 20th, 1889. And he wrote a letter to Mr. Edison. I wish to ask permission to use your air pump a little in some experiments with fresh fruit. I do not wish to remove the pump at all, but to take some glass jars to the office to extract air from them. And of course, your orders to Mr. Hibble prevent the experiments without special permission from you. And so he definitely is writing Edison. He wants to use his air pump. He's experimenting with jelly, and that's going to become prominent here in a minute. Edison replied to Mr. Hibble, not to Mr. Gardner, and he wrote a letter. Mr. Hibble was his caretaker at the time. he said, let him use my air pumps. So that was January 31st, 1889. So Mr. Gardner had made contact with the famous inventor. He wanted to use his laboratory, and Edison allowed him permission. So he wanted to take the air out of jars because just a few months later, something big was about to happen here in Fort Myers. The Seminole Canning Company, in September of 1889, they started canning guava jelly on the property that the Gardner family bought. Their nursery, they put up a little canning operation there, and they had shipped a great many canned pineapples, guavas. They started to can local fruit, 832 pounds, 832-pound cans of guavas. So the Seminole Canning Company is a new business in town, and they become very prominent with their canning company. As a matter of fact, by 1896, as I got this article from the Florida Times-Union, the canning company was the second largest producer of guava jelly in the United States, and they had a capacity of 7,000 pounds a week. So they were not just canning jelly, they were canning meats, they were canning grapefruits, they were canning bananas, all types of fruit, and they were shipping it around the country. So this was a big operation and employed 50 people, and this brought a lot of income through the revenue system here locally in Fort Myers. So the Gardners are now one of the largest business operations in town, and that got Mr. Gardner thinking, if I got this big canning factory, why don't I also add a power plant? So he decided, after waiting, this is 14 years now that the Gardners were waiting, not just the Gardners, all the businessmen in Fort Myers, realizing that Edison may never provide the town with the electricity needed to catapult us into the 20th century. Albertus Gardner saw an opportunity to provide his fellow citizens with the much sought after amenity of electricity. He let the town know of his intentions, that he was going to provide them with electricity. He put it on page 1 of the weekly press. Mr. Gardner is figuring on lighting a circuit in this town to take in the square commencing at the Gardner lot, running down 2nd Street, Hendry Street, back to Huff Street. And I have a little map of Fort Myers there. This is a very old map, one of the first maps of the town, and you can see I put it on the little grid there in red. That's where he planned on providing electricity. Now, he wanted a guarantee of 40 lights at 10 cents per light each. And he said that if he could do this, he could provide the people of Fort Myers with electricity. So that's where it begins on February 4th, 1897. After a period of 11 years, desire for progress in Southwest Florida's second largest community was at a fever pitch. Local businessmen clamored for a railroad, paved streets, and cement sidewalks in their town to help them transform into a prominent winter destination for wealthy Northerners. So they already realized that for them to make money here, and that's what Fort Myers has always been about, their businesses always wanting to make money, they knew that they needed some modern improvements here. Realizing that electricity was essential to the desire for progress, the Weekly Press, a paper devoted to promoting Fort Myers, printed this. This was on page 1. Nothing could be of more benefit to our town than electric lights, and every businessman in this place should encourage Mr. Gardner in his enterprise. So he's getting a lot of support from the local paper. As a matter of fact, the local paper began to print weekly reports informing the citizens along every step of the way. Here's a couple examples. On July 22nd, Charlotte, the crew was headed up to Charlotte Harbor on the Belle of Myers, a little steamship here locally, for a loader lighted or loaded with electrical light machinery for Mr. Gardner. On July 29th, page 8, the boiler arrives. So now we got the boiler coming in. That was a steam-powered boiler to run the dynamo generators. So the town is keeping tabs on all of this. There's a picture of the Belle of Myers. So this was a significant steamship. Did daily routes, or I should say weekly routes up to Punta Gorda. It was used for all types of purposes. And one of those obviously was to get the generators and equipment here for Mr. Gardner. On October 21st, the paper reports a charter was granted to the Seminole Canning Company to erect 10 incandescent lights of 32 candle power, each for the term of 1 year for $300. So the contract to commence when lights are installed. The charter was later extended to 5 years. So things are happening. The people of Fort Myers also agree that they need electricity here. So the charter was given. And here you go. In his one page and his first page business card, Gardner let everyone know that he was investing in state-of-the-art equipment. So Gardner's equipment was going to be state-of-the-art, shipped down from Jacksonville. He was going to have a 400 light outfit. He planned on building a duplicate plant right next to it to go in later as needed. We hope this effort of ours will be considered and treated as a desirable improvement. So he's also promoting this. Page 1 letter to the people of Fort Myers, reminding them, don't forget to buy electricity. Don't forget to buy lights. And his goal of reaching 40 lights per the start of his business eventually got shattered because of the Fort Myers Hotel. Mr. Hugh O'Neill, a wealthy New Yorker, he owned a huge department store up in Manhattan. He provided furniture for Henry Flagler and Henry B. Plant in their luxury hotels. He decided that Fort Myers could use a luxury hotel. Fort Myers had a reputation as a quaint little spot on the Caloosahatchee River. The town promoted itself through the tarpon fishing being done out on Punta Rasa. So Mr. O'Neill decided he would buy his electricity from Mr. Gardner. So that was a big boost for Mr. Gardner and a motivating factor. He already received several shipments of the electric light apparatus from the factory and expects to wire and dynamo within a few days. So this was put out on November 18th. And Mr. Heitman, another local businessman, had the contract to furnish the poles. So November 18th, 1897, things are starting to come together for the people in Fort Myers. As a matter of fact, not much later, on December 30th, here comes the dynamo generator. It came in on this steamship right here, the St. Lucie, and it was taken off of the steamship, put on rollers, and rolled up to the Seminole Canning Company from River's Edge. So just on the 30th of December, Mr. Gardner gets his generator that he wanted. And then the next article, another article written about the Fort Myers Hotel. This was a much awaited luxury hotel. That's the picture that was printed in the paper on page 8. And the hotel was touted to be the first modern hotel south of Tampa in Florida. The Gardner's goal of 40 lights was already shattered by the new luxury Fort Myers Hotel. The hotel would have 98 lights, as reported in that last article. The modern luxury hotel built by Hugh O'Neill, wired by Harry Sloan. The new hotel ended up having 235 lights. The grand opening, January 17th of this hotel. They even touted two arc lights on the exterior. So the verandas, there's a list of all the lights. Each room would have a center electrolier, three clusters of four lights in the dining room, two side lights. So this was big news here in Fort Myers. The new luxury hotel was almost completed, and the grand opening was January 17th. The picture that was printed in the paper. There's a couple more pictures. On the left is an 1898 photograph of the Fort Myers Hotel. And on the right, that is right at the turn of the century. So the hotel was a beautiful luxury hotel. You see, they had a boathouse there built right on the river. They had their own water tower. So big news here in Fort Myers. Now, a couple views of the Fort Myers Hotel. Before the hotel opened, Fort Myers got its electric lights on January 1st. So on January 1st, the first street lights lit up. The local businesses in that little grid all lit up their businesses. So the electricity was followed by the grand opening of the hotel. So things are progressing so well for Mr. Gardner that he decides that he has to expand immediately. So he immediately sends off for another generator, another dynamo, and this is being followed here. So by January 27th, he already announces expansion of the plant. He's going to build a duplicate power plant right next to the one he already has. By March 3rd, the arc lights were added to the hotel and they were hooked up to a separate generator. He got another generator for the arc lights. The boiler and engine for the duplicate electric plant arrived for Mr. Gardner shortly after that article was written on March 17th. The hotel got its own auxiliary generator. So now everyone's all in on electricity in Fort Myers. And Mr. Gardner immediately expands his plant. By May 12th, the plant expansion was complete. So all this happened in just a few months. And the powerhouse of the Gardner Electric Light Plant was fitted up first class shape. The machinery had all been enclosed and everything is running as regular as clockwork. The new dynamo and engine have been put in place. And in case any accident should happen to the dynamo now in use, the new dynamo would quickly be substituted. So he's already thinking ahead. Power outages, all the little issues that might happen. He hired Gus Wiederquist to be in charge of the machinery. He was an engineer, a specialist in electricity. And then in 1903, they applied for a second patent for an ice plant. So this now they officially become incorporated as the Seminole Power and Ice in 1903. You got to look at the big giant block of ice there. The ice plant was very prominent here for many, many years. Of course, the people of Fort Myers were thrilled. Now they didn't have to wait to ship in their ice. They could actually get their ice. It was installed in 1901, the first time they installed ice at their plant, and they started to deliver May 22nd. It cost a penny a pound for the ice. At the factory, it was sold for 50 cents for 100 pounds. So if you bought 100 pounds and went and picked it up yourself, it was 50 cents a pound. And there's a look at the Seminole canning and ice plant. Big news here in Fort Myers. On page one, by 1905, they were making 50 tons of ice daily. So this was become a huge operation. They were canning, they were making ice, and they were providing electricity for the people in Fort Myers. And this plant just continued to grow. All this will give a pressure of 200 pounds that can depend on. So now another thing, Mr. Gardner knew in 1903, after they had a devastating fire here in town, he wanted to provide the town with its first water tower. And he wanted to let the town use his water free of charge if they bought the water tower. The question of a water supply and pressure for fire protection for the town can now easily be solved. Mr. Gardner states that if the town will lay a 5-inch water pipe to connect with a similar pipe put down on First Street, that the big pump will be started up whenever there is a fire in the district. So he's trying to provide the people of Fort Myers with an opportunity to be safer. So he's very civic minded also. Now, as far as his relationship with Mr. Edison, in 1904, Mr. Edison inquired from Mr. Gardner about providing a charging station for his electric launch. And he wrote this letter to Mr. Gardner and requesting, well, he sent his man up, Mr. Edison, not himself. So who he sent up was Ewald Stolpner. He visited the power plant and inquired about getting his boat charged. So Mr. Gardner said, yeah, sure, we'll be more than happy to provide you with a charging station. We can easily arrange for you to have a charging station at the Myers Hotel dock or the steamboat dock, or both. You would need to bring a meter and plug and socket for each place. Distance from the plant to the Edison's house is something like 7,000 feet, quite a distance to carry our current without much drop. If you could step it up and down there, you would be all right. The reason I'm putting this in, because many people ask me, what kind of electricity did they use here? Well, there it is. We are using the minimum 220 volt direct current system carrying 230 off the plant. If you desire to put a line from here to the Edison place and be independent of our other lines, we can probably arrange to let you have the use of one engine, except fall-offs from 5 to 9, and could then, if business would justify, carry steam on an extra boiler. So it was a direct current system that was being used here in 1904. This way you could probably get 50 or more amperes delivered at your place at any voltage you might desire from 230 down. So Edison's reply, none. Instead, he writes a letter to Ewald Stolpner, and actually he tells Stolpner, go find an engineer, get over to my property, and let's get my generators and everything running. So he did not want to buy electricity from Mr. Gardner. That's not how it ended up, though. As a matter of fact, Edison did get electricity from Mr. Gardner in 1904 in his winter stay here. And then he left a man behind to put new wires and build up his system here to a more modern type. So that was how it ended up with Mr. Ewald Stolpner and Mr. Gardner communicating about electricity. The first water tower finally got put in here in 1911, adjacent to the Gardner property, and Gardner did provide all the water to fill that tower up from his well on his property. There's a look at the very first water tower in Fort Myers in 1911. So that is on Anderson, or as we know today, MLK Boulevard. And if it wasn't for the motivating factor of the water to be provided by the Gardner family, that water tower would have never got built there. And engineering in 1913, Mr. Gardner finally sells his power plant. He sells it to the Engineering and Securities Company of New York. He sold his power plant for $104,000. Now, they started their property. They bought that property for $3,500. they started the Seminole Canning Company with a $10 cash investment, and they turned their windfall into $104,000 in 1913. The the company in New York quickly changed its name to Southern Utilities, and Southern Utilities immediately began to modernize the plant. So they right away, the first thing they did was they put $100,000 into this plant. They wanted to provide 24-hour electricity round the clock. They jacked up the electric prices. That's a whole other story. And the people of Fort Myers rebelled against that. And they ended up taking it back down, the price of electricity here. But you can see they immediately went to work on improving their plant. As a matter of fact, by in December of 1925, the company was then sold to FP&L, Florida Power and Light, still owns it today. And they still have a substation over there, by the way. If you ever drive downtown Fort Myers, go up 2nd and Lee Street, you'll see a little substation located there. So Florida Power and Light, they take over all these companies. You can see on the right-hand side, Southern Utilities, one of them, but they pretty much get a stranglehold on the state of Florida, and they begin to take over the power. So in 1926, it was made official in the paper. The deal went down in December of 1925. And you can see that's the best picture I could find of Florida Power and Light and ice plant. So there you go. There's the ice plant. That is a 1930 photograph. The beautiful plant that you're looking at the corner right on MLK Boulevard there. That's where the main entrance was. And the plant was located there all the way for a long time. The Florida Power and Light eventually built a new plant in 1958. They expanded and they moved their plant to over by the river where it is today. Florida Power and Light said a giant is born. There's a look at the Fort Myers plant right there. Now, that's obviously, as soon as the Southern Utilities took over, they began to use alternating current there. So if you're trying to put a timeline on when did alternating current take over here in Fort Myers, right around 1913 would be the time for that. 1958, the biggest single year of power plant expansion in the company's history up until that point. The Fort Myers plant is scheduled to go into operation in November. A similar 160,000 kilowatt unit was added to the FP&L system last April, making a total of 320,000 kilowatts added this year. So Fort Myers at this point, they had the largest power plant in FP&L's conglomeration, and that's pretty much how we got our electricity here in Fort Myers. Now, moving on, we just don't want to forget about the lasting legacy that the Gardners left. They built the Richards Building, also known as the Pythian Building on Hendry Street, which has had a little controversy here lately as they painted it white. They provided the town of Fort Myers with their first water, and their home lasted all the way until 1994. Unfortunately, the Gardner home on 2nd and Lee was tore down and lost to history. There's no sign left of the Gardners here in Fort Myers. The history has pretty much been wiped out, the physical history. The Gardners also owned property in Alva. They have a little house out there in Alva, and they had a orchard out there. I'm not sure what happened to that either. Haven't gotten that far yet because I was focused in on the electrical plant that Mr. Gardner built here in Fort Myers. And if you're wondering where I got all my information from, here it is. And there's not a lot of pictures of the Gardners that I could find. I spent 4 months searching for some original pictures of the ice plant, unable to find them. So that's the end of our story about how Fort Myers got their electricity. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great afternoon. I'm glad that you signed up for our digital step into history.